The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 3, Side 2. In 1439, Greeks met Italians at the Council of Florence, and the lessons they exchanged in language had far more result than their laborious negotiations in theology. There, Gemistus Pletho gave the famous lectures that ended the reign of Aristotle in European philosophy and enthroned Plato as almost a god. When the council dispersed, Joannes Bessarion, who had come to it as Bishop of Nicaea, remained in Italy and gave part of his time to teaching Greek. Other cities contracted the fever. Bessarion brought it to Rome. Theodorus Gaza taught Greek at Mantua, Ferrara in 1444, and Rome in 1451. Demetrius Chalcondyles taught at Perugia in 1450, Padua, Florence, and Milan from circa 1492 to 1511. Joannes Argyropoulos at Padua in 1441, Florence from 1456 to 1471, and Rome from 1471 to 1486. All these men came to Italy before the fall of Constantinople in 1453, so that event played a minor role in the transit of Greek from Byzantium to Italy. But the gradual encirclement of Constantinople by the Turks after 1356 shared in persuading Greek scholars to go west. One of those who fled at the collapse of the eastern capital was Constantine Lascaris, who came to teach Greek at Milan from 1460 to 1465, Naples and Messina from 1466 to 1501. The first Greek book printed in Renaissance Italy was his Greek grammar. With all these scholars and their pupils enthusiastically active in Italy, it was but a short time when the classics of Greek literature and philosophy were rendered into Latin with more thoroughness, accuracy, and finish than in the 12th and 13th centuries. Guarino translated parts of Strabo and Plutarch, Traversari, Diogenes Laertius, Valla, Herodotus, Thucydides, and the Iliad, Perotti, Polybius, Ficino, Plato, and Plotinus. Plato, above all, amazed and delighted the humanists. They gloried in the fluid grace of his style. They found in the dialogues a drama more vivid and contemporary than anything in Aeschylus, Sophocles, or Euripides. They envied and marveled at the freedom with which the Greeks of Socrates' time discussed the most crucial problems of religion and politics. And they thought they had found in Plato, clouded with Plotinus, a mystical philosophy that would enable them to retain a Christianity that they had ceased to believe in but never ceased to love. Moved by the eloquence of Gemistus Pletho and the enthusiasm of his pupils at Florence, Cosimo established there, in 1445, a Platonic academy for the study of Plato, and provided handsomely for Marsilio Ficino to give half a lifetime to the translation and exposition of Plato's works. Now, after a reign of 400 years, scholasticism lost its domination in the philosophy of the West. The dialogue and essay replaced the Scholastica Disputatio as the form of philosophical exposition, and the exhilarating spirit of Plato entered like an energizing yeast into the rising body of European thought. But as Italy recovered more and more of its own classic heritage, the admiration of the humanists for Greece was surpassed by their pride in the literature and art of ancient Rome. They revived Latin as a medium of living literature. They Latinized their names and Romanized the terms of Christian worship and life. God became Jupiter, Providence Fatum, the saints Divi, nuns Vestales, the Pope Pontifex Maximus. They fashioned their prose style on Cicero, their poetry on Virgil and Horace, and some, like Filelfo, Valla, and Politian, achieved an almost classic elegance. So, in its course, the Renaissance moved back from Greek to Latin, from Athens to Rome. 15 centuries appeared to fall away, and the age of Cicero and Horace, of Ovid and Seneca, seemed reborn. Style became more important than substance, form triumphed over matter, and the oratory of majestic periods rang again in the halls of princes and pedagogues. Perhaps it would have been better if the humanists had used Italian, but they looked down upon the speech of the Commedia and the Canzoniere as a corrupt and degenerate Latin, which almost it was, and deplored Dante's choice of the vernacular tongue. As a penalty, the humanists lost touch with the living sources of literature. and the people, leaving their works to the aristocracy, preferred the jolly tales, or novelle, of Sacchetti and Bandello, or the exciting mixture of war and love in the romances that were being translated or adapted into Italian from the French. Nevertheless, this passing infatuation with a dying language and an immortal literature helped Italian authors to recapture the architecture, sculpture, and music of style, and to formulate the canons of taste and utterance that lifted the vernaculars to literary form and set a goal and a standard for art. In the field of history, it was the humanists who ended the succession of medieval chronicles, chaotic and uncritical, by scrutinizing and harmonizing sources, marshaling the matter into order and clarity, vitalizing and humanizing the past by mingling biography with history, and raising their narratives to some level of philosophy by discerning causes, currents, and effects, and studying the regularities and lessons of history. The humanist movement spread throughout Italy, but until the accession of a Florentine Medici to the papacy, its leaders were almost all citizens or graduates of Florence. Coluccio Salutati, who became executive secretary or chancellor, cancellarius, to the signory in 1375, was a bridge from Petrarch and Boccaccio to Cosimo, knowing and loving all three. The public documents drawn up by him were models of classical Latinity, and set an example that officials in Venice, Milan, Naples, and Rome bestirred themselves to follow. Gian Galeazzo, Visconti of Milan, said that Salutati had done him more harm by excellence of style than could have come from an army of mercenaries. The fame of Niccolo de Niccoli as a Latin stylist rivaled his renown as a collector of manuscripts. Bruni called him the censor of the Latin tongue, and, like other authors, submitted his own writings to Niccoli for correction before publishing them. Niccoli filled his house with ancient classics, statuary, inscriptions, vases, coins, and gems. He avoided marriage lest it distract him from his books, but found time for a concubine stolen from his brother's bed. He opened his library to all who cared to study there, and urged young Florentines to abandon luxury for literature. Seeing a wealthy youth idling the day away, Niccoli asked him, "What is your object in life?" "To have a good time," was the frank reply. "But when your youth is over, of what consequence will you be?" The youth saw the point and put himself under Niccoli's tutelage. Leonardo Bruni, secretary to 4 popes and then, from 1427 to 1444, to the Florentine signory, translated several dialogues of Plato into a Latin whose excellence for the first time fully revealed the splendor of Plato's style to Italy. He composed a Latin history of Florence, for which the Republic exempted him and his children from taxation, and his speeches were compared with those of Pericles. When he died, the priors decreed him a public funeral after the manner of the ancients. He was buried in the church of Santa Croce, with his history on his breast, and Bernardo Rossellini designed for his resting place a noble and sumptuous tomb. Born like Bruni in Arezzo and succeeding him as secretary to the signory, Carlo Marsupini awed his time by carrying half the classics of Greece and Rome in his head. He left hardly one ancient author unquoted in his inaugural address as professor of literature in the University of Florence. His admiration for pagan antiquity was such that he felt called upon to reject Christianity. Nevertheless, he became for a time apostolic secretary to the Roman See, and though he was said to have died without bothering to receive the sacraments, he too was buried in Santa Croce under gorgeous oratory by Gionozzo Manetti and an ornate tomb by Desiderio da Settignano. This in 1453. Manetti, who pronounced this eulogy over an atheist, was a man whose piety rivaled his learning. For 9 years he hardly stirred from his house and garden, steeping himself in classical literature and learning Hebrew as well as Latin and Greek. Sent as ambassador to Rome, Naples, Venice, Genoa, he charmed all and won friendships precious to his government by his culture, his liberality, and his integrity. All these men except Salutati were members of the circle that gathered in the city house or country villa of Cosimo, and led the movement of scholarship during his ascendancy. Another friend of Cosimo almost equaled him as a host to learning. Ambrogio Traversari, general of the Camaldolite order, lived in a cell in the monastery of Santa Maria degli Angeli, near Florence. He mastered Greek and suffered qualms of conscience in his affection for the classics. He refrained from quoting them in his writings, but revealed their influence in a Latin style whose idiomatic purity would have shocked all the famous Gregorys. Cosimo, who knew how to reconcile the classics as well as high finance with Christianity, loved to visit him. Niccoli, Marsupini, Bruni, and others made his cell a literary rendezvous. The most active and troublesome of the Italian humanists was Poggio Bracciolini. Born poor near Arezzo in 1380, he was educated at Florence, studied Greek under Manuel Chrysoloras, supported himself by copying manuscripts, was befriended by Salutati, and secured appointment at 24 as a secretary in the papal chancery at Rome. For the next half-century he served the Curia, never taking even minor orders but wearing ecclesiastical dress. Valuing his energy and his learning, the Curia sent him on a dozen missions. From these he digressed time and again to search for classic manuscripts. His credentials as a papal secretary won him access to the most jealously guarded or most carelessly neglected treasures in the monastic libraries at St. Gall, Langres, Weingarten, and Reichenau, and his spoils were so rich that Bruni and other humanists hailed him as epical. Back in Rome he wrote for Martin V vigorous defenses of church dogmas, and then, in private gatherings, joined with other employees of the Curia in laughing at the Christian creed. He composed dialogues and letters in rough but breezy Latin, satirizing the vices of the clergy even while practicing them to the extent of his means. When Cardinal Sant'Angelo reproved him for having children, which hardly befitted a man in ecclesiastical dress, and for maintaining a mistress, which seemed unbecoming in a layman, Poggio replied with his usual insolence, "I have children, which is becoming to a layman, and I have a mistress, which is an old custom of the clergy." At 55 he abandoned the mistress who had given him 14 children and married a girl of 18. Meanwhile, he almost founded modern archaeology by collecting ancient coins, inscriptions, and statuary, and by describing with scholarly precision the surviving monuments of classic Rome. He accompanied Pope Eugenius IV to the Council of Florence, quarreled with Francesco Filelfo, and exchanged with him enthusiastic invectives of the coarsest indecency, peppered with accusations of theft, atheism, and sodomy. Again in Rome, he worked with especial pleasure for the humanist Pope Nicholas V. At 70, he composed his famous Liber Facetiarum, a collection of stories, satires, and obscenities. When Lorenzo Valla joined the papal secretariat, Poggio attacked him in a new series of invectivae, charging him with larceny, forgery, treachery, heresy, drunkenness, and immorality. Valla replied by laughing at Poggio's Latin, quoting his sins against grammar and idiom, and setting him aside as a fool in his dotage. No one but the immediate victim took such literary assaults seriously. They were competitive essays in Latin composition. Indeed, Poggio proclaimed in one of them that he would show how well classic Latin could express the most modern ideas and the most private concerns. He was so adept in the art of erudite scurrility that the whole world, says Vespasiano, was afraid of him. His pen, like that of a later Aretine, became an instrument of blackmail. When Alfonso of Naples delayed in acknowledging Poggio's gift of Xenophon's Cyropedia, translated into Latin, the irate humanist hinted that a good pen could stab any king, and Alfonso hastily sent him 500 ducats to hold his tongue. After enjoying every instinct and impulse for 70 years, Poggio composed a treatise, De Miseriis Humanae Conditiones, in which he reckoned that the ills of life outweigh the joys, and concluded like Solon that the luckiest people are those who escape being born. At 72 he returned to Florence, was soon made secretary to the Signory, and finally was elected to the Signory itself. He expressed his appreciation by writing a history of Florence in the style of the ancients, politics, war, and imaginary speeches. Other humanists breathed relief when at last, at age 79, he died, this in 1459. He, too, was buried in Santa Croce. His statue by Donatello was erected on the facade of the Duomo, and in 1560, in the confusion of some alterations, it was set up inside the cathedral as one of the 12 apostles. It is clear that Christianity, in both its theology and its ethics, had lost its hold on perhaps a majority of the Italian humanists. Several, like Traversari, Bruni, and Manetti in Florence, Vittorino da Feltre in Mantua, Guarino da Verona in Ferrara, and Flavio Biondo in Rome, remained loyal to the faith. But to many others, the revelation of a Greek culture lasting 1,000 years and reaching the heights of literature, philosophy, and art in complete independence of Judaism and Christianity, was a mortal blow to their belief in the Pauline theology, or in the doctrine of nulla salus extra ecclesiam, no salvation outside the church. Socrates and Plato became for them uncanonized saints. The dynasty of the Greek philosophers seemed to them superior to the Greek and Latin fathers. The prose of Plato and Cicero made even a cardinal ashamed of the Greek of the New Testament and the Latin of Jerome's translation. The grandeur of imperial Rome seemed nobler than the timid retreat of convinced Christians into monastic cells. The free thought and conduct of Periclean Greeks or Augustan Romans filled many humanists with an envy that shattered in their hearts the Christian code of humility, otherworldliness, continence. And they wondered why they should subject body, mind, and soul to the rule of ecclesiastics who themselves were now joyously converted to the world. For these humanists, the 10 centuries between Constantine and Dante were a tragic error, a Dantesque losing of the right road. The lovely legends of the Virgin and the saints faded from their memory to make room for Ovid's Metamorphoses and Horace's ambisexual odes. The great cathedrals now seemed barbarous, and their gaunt statuary lost all charm for eyes that had seen, fingers that had touched, the Apollo Belvedere. So the humanists, by and large, acted as if Christianity were a myth conformable to the needs of popular imagination and morality, but not to be taken seriously by emancipated minds. They supported it in their public pronouncements, professed a saving orthodoxy, and struggled to harmonize Christian doctrine with Greek philosophy. The very effort betrayed them. Implicitly, they accepted reason as the supreme court and honored Plato's dialogues equally with the New Testament. Like the sophists of pre-Socratic Greece, they directly or indirectly, willfully or unwittingly, undermined their hearers' religious faith. Their lives reflected their actual creed. Many of them accepted and practiced the ethics of paganism in the sensual rather than in the Stoic sense. The only immortality they recognized was that which came through the recording of great deeds. They, with their pens, not God would confer it, would destine men to everlasting glory or shame. A generation after Cosimo, they would agree to share this magic power with the artists who carved or painted the effigies of patrons, or built noble edifices that preserved a donor's name. The desire of patrons to achieve such mundane immortality was one of the strongest generative forces in the art and literature of the Renaissance. The influence of the humanists was for a century the dominant factor in the intellectual life of Western Europe. They taught writers a sharper sense of structure and form. They taught them also the artifices of rhetoric, the frills of language, the abracadabra of mythology, the fetishism of classical quotation, the sacrifice of significance to correctness of speech and beauty of style. Their infatuation with Latin postponed for a century, from 1400 to 1500, the development of Italian poetry and prose. They emancipated science from theology, but impeded it by worshipping the past and by stressing erudition rather than objective observation and original thought. Strange to say, they were least influential in the universities. These were already old in Italy, and at Bologna, Padua, Pisa, Piacenza, Pavia, Naples, Siena, Arezzo, Lucca, the faculties of law, medicine, theology, and arts, that is, language, literature, rhetoric, and philosophy, were too mortized in medieval custom to allow a new emphasis on ancient cultures. At most, they yielded, here and there, a chair of rhetoric to a humanist. The influence of the revival of letters operated chiefly through academies founded by patron princes in Florence, Naples, Venice, Ferrara, Mantua, Milan, and Rome. There, the humanists dictated in Greek or Latin the classic text they proposed to discuss. At each step they commented in Latin on the grammatical, rhetorical, geographical, biographical, and literary aspects of the text. Their students took down the dictated text, and in the margins much of the commentary. In this way, copies of the classics, and of commentaries as well, were multiplied and were scattered into the world. The age of Cosimo was therefore a period of devoted scholarship rather than of creative literature. Grammar, lexicography, archaeology, rhetoric, and the critical revision of classical texts were the literary glories of the time. The form, machinery, and substance of modern erudition were established. A bridge was built by which the legacy of Greece and Rome passed into the modern mind. Not since the days of the Sophists had scholars risen to so high a place in society and politics. The Humanists became secretaries and advisors to senates, signories, dukes, and popes, repaying their favors with classic eulogies and their snubs with poisoned epigrams. They transformed the ideal of a gentleman from a man with ready sword and clanking spurs into that of the fully developed individual attaining to wisdom and worth by absorbing the cultural heritage of the race. The prestige of their learning and the fascination of their eloquence conquered Transalpine Europe at the very time when the arms of France, Germany, and Spain were preparing to conquer Italy. Country after country was inoculated with the new culture and passed from medievalism to modernity. The same century that saw the discovery of America saw the rediscovery of Greece and Rome, and the literary and philosophical transformation had far profounder results for the human spirit than the circumnavigation and exploration of the globe. For it was the humanists, not the navigators, who liberated man from dogma, taught him to love life rather than brood about death, and made the European mind free. Humanism influenced art last because it appealed rather to intellect than to sense. The chief patron of art was still the Church, and the chief purpose of art was still to convey the Christian story to the letterless and to adorn the house of God. The Virgin and her child, the suffering and crucified Christ, the prophets, apostles, fathers, and saints remained the necessary subjects of sculpture and painting, even of the minor arts. Gradually, however, the humanists taught the Italians a more sensual sense of beauty, a frank admiration for the healthy human body, male or female, preferably nude, permeated the educated classes. The reaffirmation of life in Renaissance literature, as against the medieval contemplation of another world, gave art a secret secular leaning. And by finding Italian Aphrodites to pose as virgins, and Italian Apollos to serve as Sebastians, the painters of Lorenzo's age, and later, introduced pagan motives into Christian art. In the 16th century, when secular princes rivaled ecclesiastics in financing artists, Venus and Ariadne, Daphne and Diana, the Muses and the Graces challenged the rule of the Virgin, but Mary, the modest mother, continued her wholesome dominance to the end of Renaissance art. 5. Architecture, the age of Brunellesco. "Cursed be the man who invented this wretched Gothic architecture," cried Antonio Filarete in 1450. "Only a barbarous people could have brought it to Italy." Those walls of glass hardly suited the son of Italy. Those flying buttresses, though at Notre Dame de Paris they had been forged into a frame of beauty like fountain jets petrified in their flow, seemed to the South unsightly scaffoldings left by builders who had failed to give their structures a self-contained stability. The Gothic style of pointed arch and soaring vault had well expressed the aspirations of tender spirits turning from the laborious soil to the solacing sky. But men new dowered with wealth and ease wished now to beautify life, not to escape or malign it. Earth would be heaven, and they themselves would be gods. The architecture of the Italian Renaissance was not basically a revolt against Gothic, for Gothic had never conquered Italy. Every kind of style and influence spoke its piece in the experiments of the 14th and 15th centuries. The heavy columns and round arches of Lombard Romanesque, the Greek cross of some ground plans, the Byzantine pendentive and dome, the stately grace of campaniles, echoing Moslem minarets, the slender columns of Tuscan cloisters, remembering mosque or classic porticos, the beamed ceilings of England and Germany, the groined vault and ogive and tracery of Gothic, the harmonious majesty of Roman facades, and above all the simple strength of the basilican nave, flanked by its supporting aisles. All these, in Italy, were mingling fruitfully when the humanists turned architectural vision to the ruins of Rome. Then the shattered colonnades of the Forum, rising through the medieval mist, seemed to Italian eyes more beautiful than the Byzantine bizarreries of Venice, the somber majesty of Chartres, the fragile audacity of Beauvais, or the mystic reaches of Amiens' vault. To build again with columns finely turned, firmly mortised into massive plinths, gaily crowned with flowering capitals and bound to stability by imperturbable architraves. This became, by the groping emergence of the buried but living past, the dream and passion of men like Brunellesco, Alberti, Michelozzo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Of Filippo Brunellesco, wrote the patriotic Vasari, It may be said that he was given by heaven to invest architecture with new forms, after it had wandered astray for many centuries. Like so many artists of the Italian Renaissance, he began as a goldsmith. He graduated into sculpture, and for a time entered into friendly rivalry with Donatello. He competed with him and Ghiberti for a commission to sculpture the bronze doors of the Florentine baptistry. When he saw Ghiberti's sketches, he pronounced them superior to his own, and with Donatello he left Florence to study perspective and design in Rome. He was fascinated by the ancient and medieval architecture there. He measured the major buildings in all their elements. He marveled above all at the dome of Agrippa's Pantheon, 142 feet wide. And he conceived the idea of crowning with such a dome the unfinished cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore in the city of his birth. He returned to Florence in time to take part in a conference of architects and engineers on the problem of roofing the cathedral's octagonal choir, 138.5 feet across. Filippo proposed a dome, but the expansive pressure that so immense a cupola would exert upon walls unsupported by external buttresses or internal beams seemed to the conferees a forbidding obstacle. All the world knows the story of Brunellesco's egg, how he challenged the other artists to make an egg stand on end, and after all the rest had failed, himself succeeded by pressing the blunt and empty end down upon the table. When they protested that they could have done the same, he answered that they would make similar claims after he had domed the cathedral. He received the commission. For 14 years, from 1420 to 1434, he labored intermittently at the task, fighting 1,000 tribulations, raising the cupola precariously 133 feet above the summit of its supporting walls. At last it was finished and stood firm. All the city gloried in it as the first major achievement, and with one exception the boldest, in the architecture of the Renaissance. When Michelangelo, a century later, planned the dome of St. Peter's and was told that he had an opportunity to surpass Brunellesco's, he answered, "I will make a sister dome, larger but not more beautiful." The lordly, colorful cupola still dominates, for leagues around, the panorama of a red-roofed Florence nestling like a bed of roses in the lap of the Tuscan hills. Though Filippo had taken his conception from the Pantheon, he had compromised gracefully with the Tuscan Gothic style of the Florentine cathedral by curving his dome along the lines of the Gothic pointed arch. But in buildings that he was allowed to design from the ground, he made his classic revolution more explicit and complete. In 1419 he had begun, for Cosimo's father, the church of San Lorenzo. He finished only the old sacristy, but there he chose the basilican form, the colonnade and entablature, and the Romanesque arch as the elements of his plan. In the cloisters of Santa Croce, he built for the Pazzi family a pretty chapel, again recalling the dome and colonnaded portico of the Pantheon. And in those same cloisters he designed a rectangular portal, of fluted columns, flowered capitals, sculptured architrave, and lunette reliefs, which formed the style of 100,000 Renaissance doors, and survives everywhere in Western Europe and America. He began on classic lines the church of Santo Spirito, but died while the walls had barely left the ground. In 1446, the corpse of the passionate builder lay in state in the cathedral under the dome that he had raised, and from Cosimo to the simple working man who had labored there, the people of Florence came to mourn that geniuses must die. He lived as a good Christian, said Vasari, and left to the world the savor of his goodness. From the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans until now, there has been no man more rare or more excellent. In his architectural enthusiasm, Brunellesco had designed for Cosimo a palace so extensive and ornate that the modest dictator, fearing envy, denied himself the luxury of seeing it take form. Instead, he commissioned Michelozzo di Bartolomeo in 1444 to build for him, his family, and his offices the existing Palazzo Medici, or Riccardi, whose thick stone walls, bare of ornament, reveal the social disorder, the family feuds, the daily dread of violence or revolt that gave a zest to Florentine politics. Immense iron gates opened to friends and diplomats, artists and poets, access to a court decorated with statuary by Donatello, and thence to rooms of moderate splendor, and a chapel brightened by the stately and colorful frescoes of Benozzo Gozzoli. There the Medici lived till 1538, with interludes of banishment. But surely they often left those gloomy walls to take the sun at the villas that Cosimo built outside the city, in Correggi and Capagiolo, and on the slopes of Fiesole. It was in those rural retreats that Cosimo and Lorenzo, with their friends and protégés, took refuge from politics in poetry, philosophy, and art. And to Correggi, father and grandson retired for their rendezvous with death. Glancing now and then beyond the grave, Cosimo gave substantial sums to raise an abbey at Fiesole, and to rebuild more commodiously the old convent of San Marco. There Michelozzo designed graceful cloisters, a library for Niccoli's books, and a cell where occasionally Cosimo withdrew even from his friends, and spent a day in meditation and prayer. In these enterprises Michelozzo was his favorite architect and the unfailing friend who accompanied him into exile, and returned with him. Soon thereafter the Signory gave Michelozzo the delicate task of reinforcing the Palazzo Vecchio against threatened collapse. He restored the church of Santissima Annunziata, made a lovely tabernacle for it, and showed himself a sculptor too, by adorning it with a statue of St. John the Baptist. For Cosimo's son Piero he built a magnificent marble chapel in the hillside church of San Miniato. He pooled his skill with Donatello's to design and carve the charming pulpit of the girdle on the facade of the Prato Cathedral. In any other country in that age, Michelozzo would have led his architectural tribe. Meanwhile, the merchant aristocracy was raising proud civic halls and palaces. In 1376, the Signory commissioned Benediccione and Simone di Francesco Talenti to build a portico opposite the Palazzo Vecchio as a rostrum for governmental oratory. In the 16th century it came to be known as the Loggia dei Lanzi, from the German lancers that Duke Cosimo I stationed there. The most magnificent private palace in Florence was built in 1459 for the banker Luca Pitti by Luca Fancelli, from plans made by Brunelleschi 19 years before. Pitti was almost as rich as Cosimo, but not so wisely modest. He contested Cosimo's power and drew from him some sharp counsel. "You strive toward the indefinite, I toward the definite. You plant your ladder in the air, I place mine on the ground. It seems to me but just and natural that I should desire the honor and reputation of my house to surpass yours. Let us therefore do like two big dogs, which sniff at one another when they meet, show their teeth, and then go their separate ways. You will attend to your affairs, I to mine." Pitti continued to plot. After Cosimo's death, he conspired to displace Piero de' Medici from power. He committed the only crime universally condemned in the Renaissance. He failed. He was banished and ruined, and his palace remained unfinished for a century. 6. Sculpture. 1. Ghiberti. The imitation of classic forms was more thorough in sculpture than in architecture. The sight and study of Roman ruins, and the occasional recovery of some Roman masterpiece, stirred the sculptors of Italy to an emulative ecstasy. When the hermaphrodite that now lies in the Borghese Gallery, with its neutral back modestly turned to the spectator, was found in the vineyard of San Celso, Ghiberti wrote of it, "No tongue could describe the learning and art displayed in it, or do justice to its masterly style." The perfection of such works, he said, eluded the eye and could be appreciated only by passing the hand over the marble surface and curves. As these exhumed relics grew in number and familiarity, the Italian mind slowly accustomed itself to the nude in art. The study of anatomy became as much at home in artists' botteghe as in medical halls. Soon nude models were used without fear and without reproach. So stimulated, sculpture graduated from subservience to architecture, and from stone or stucco reliefs to statues of bronze or marble in the round. But it was in relief that sculpture won its first and most famous triumph in the Florence of Cosimo's time. The ugly striated baptistry that fronted the cathedral could only be redeemed by incidental ornament. Jacopo Toriti had adorned the tribune, and Andrea Tafi the cupola, with crowded mosaics. Andrea Pisano had molded a double bronze portal for the south facade from 1330 to 1336. Now, in 1401, the Florentine Signory, in conjunction with the Guild of Wool Merchants, and to persuade the deity to end a plague, voted a generous sum to provide the baptistry with a bronze door for the north side. The competition was open, All the artists of Italy were invited to submit designs. The most successful, Brunelleschi, Jacopo della Quercia, Lorenzo Ghiberti, and a few others, were commissioned and paid to cast in bronze a sample panel showing the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham. A year later, the completed panels were submitted to 34 judges, sculptors, painters, and goldsmiths. It was generally agreed that Ghiberti's was the best, and the youth of 25 began the first pair of his famous bronze doors. Only those who have closely studied this north portal can understand why it took the better part of 21 years to design and cast. Ghiberti was aided in generous fellowship by Donatello, Michelozzo, and a large corps of assistants. It was as if all were resolved, and all Florence expected, that these should be the finest bronze reliefs in the history of art. Ghiberti divided the pair into 28 panels. 20 told the life of Christ, 4 pictured apostles, 4 represented doctors of the Church. When all these had been designed, criticized, redesigned, cast, and set in place on the door, the donors, not grudging the 22,000 florins, or $500,000 already spent, engaged Ghiberti to make a corresponding double door for the east side of the baptistry in 1425. In this second undertaking, covering 27 years, Ghiberti had as assistants men already renowned or soon to be: Brunelleschi, Antonio Filarete, Paolo Uccello, Antonio del Palaiuolo, and others. His studio became in the process a school of art that nurtured a dozen geniuses. As the first pair of doors had illustrated the New Testament, so now, in 10 panels, Ghiberti presented Old Testament scenes, from the creation of man to the visit of the Queen of Sheba to Solomon. In the borders he added 20 figures in almost full relief, and varied ornament, animal and floral, of surpassing loveliness. Here the Middle Ages and the Renaissance met in perfect harmony. In the very first panel, the medieval themes of the creation of Adam, the temptation of Eve, and the expulsion from Eden were treated with a classic flow of drapery and a bold exuberance of nudes. And Eve, emerging from Adam's flesh, rivaled the Hellenistic relief of Aphrodite rising from the sea. Men were astonished to find, in the background of the actions, landscapes almost as precise in perspective and as rich in detail, met in perfect harmony. In the very first panel, the medieval themes of the creation of Adam, the temptation of Eve, and the expulsion from Eden were treated with a classic flow of drapery and a bold exuberance of nudes. And Eve, emerging from Adam's flesh, rivaled the Hellenistic relief of Aphrodite rising from the sea. Men were astonished to find, in the background of the actions, landscapes almost as precise in perspective and as rich in detail as in the best painting of the time. Some complained that this sculpture infringed too much on painting and overstepped the traditions of classical relief. It was academically true, but the effect was vivid and superb. This second double door was by common consent even finer than the first. Michelangelo considered it so fine that it would grace the entrance of paradise, and Vasari, doubtless thinking only of reliefs, pronounced it perfect in every particular, the finest masterpiece in the world, whether among the ancients or the moderns. Florence was so pleased that it elected Ghiberti to the signory and gave him a substantial property to support his declining years. 2. Donatello. Vasari thought that Donatello had been among the artists chosen to make trial panels for the baptistry doors, but Donatello was only a lad of 16 at the time. The affectionate diminutive by which his friends and posterity named him denoted Donato di Niccolo di Beto Bardi. He learned his art only partly in Ghiberti's studio. He soon struck out for himself, passed from the feminine grace of Ghibertian relief to virile statuary in the round, and revolutionized sculpture not so much by adopting classic methods and aims as by his uncompromising fidelity to nature and the blunt force of his original personality and style. He was an independent spirit as tough as his David, as bold as his St. George. His genius did not develop as rapidly as Ghiberti's, but it reached greater scope and heights. When it matured, it spawned masterpieces with reckless fertility until Florence was populated with his statues, and countries beyond the Alps echoed his fame. At 22, he rivaled Ghiberti by carving for Or San Michele a figure of St. Peter. At 27, he surpassed him by adding to that edifice a St. Mark, so strong and simple and sincere that it would have been impossible, said Michelangelo, to reject the gospel preached by such a straightforward man as this. At 23, Donatello was engaged to carve a David for the cathedral. It was only the first of many Davids made by him. The subject never ceased to please his fancy. Perhaps his finest work is the bronze David ordered by Cosimo, cast in 1430, set up in the courtyard of the Medici palace and now in the Bargello. Here the nude figure in the round made its unblushing debut in Renaissance sculpture. A body smooth with the firm texture of youthful flesh, a face perhaps too Greek in profile, a helmet certainly too Greek. In this instance Donatello put realism aside, indulged his imagination richly, and almost equaled Michelangelo's more famous figure of the future Hebrew king. He was not so successful with the Baptist. It was a dour subject alien to his earthly spirit. The two statues of John in the Bargello are lifeless and absurd. Far finer is a stone relief of a child's head, named, for no good reason, San Giovannino, the youthful St. John. In the same Salone Donatelliano, St. George unites all the idealism of a militant Christianity with the restrained lines of Greek art. A figure firmly and confidently poised, a body mature and strong, a head gothically oval and yet prefiguring the classic Brutus of Buonarroti. For the cathedral facade at Florence, he made two powerful figures, of Jeremiah and Habakkuk, the latter so bald that Donatello called him Lo Zuccone, the big pumpkin. On the Loggia dei Lanzi, Donatello's bronze Judith, commissioned by Cosimo, still brandishes her sword over Holofernes. The wine-drugged general sleeps placidly before his decapitation. He is masterfully conceived and cast, but the young tyrannicide, overwhelmed with drapery, approaches her deed with inopportune calm. On a brief trip to Rome in 1432, Donatello designed a classic tabernacle in marble for the old St. Peter's. This book is continued on Cassette 4, Side 1.